In 1587, more than 100 English settlers arrived on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. They were not simply explorers passing through, nor soldiers on a temporary mission. Among them were men, women and children sent across the Atlantic to build what England hoped would become a permanent foothold in the New World. It was an ambitious dream, but also a deeply fragile one. Roanoke stood far from England, exposed to an unfamiliar landscape, uncertain alliances, and the constant threat of isolation. From the very beginning, the colony was less a triumph than a wager. If supplies held, if leadership remained steady, if help returned on time, it might survive. If not, it could disappear almost as quickly as it had begun. The governor of the colony, John White, soon sailed back to England for supplies. He likely expected the separation to last only months. Instead, war with Spain disrupted English shipping, and what should have been a short absence stretched into nearly 3 years. By the time White finally returned to Roanoke in 1590, the world he had left behind was no longer waiting for him. He did not come back to a colony in distress. He came back to silence. The settlers were gone, the homes stood empty, and whatever had happened in his absence had left behind almost no clear explanation. There were no bodies. No obvious battlefield, no sign of a final desperate defense. The colony did not appear to have been violently destroyed. Instead, it looked as though life had been interrupted and then carried away, as if the people had stepped beyond the edge of the record and taken the answer with them. Yet one clue remained, and that clue would define the mystery for centuries. Carved into a wooden post was the word CROATOAN. Elsewhere, the letters CRO were said to have been cut into a nearby tree. At first glance it looked like a message, but the meaning of that message has never stopped shifting. It mattered because before White left, he had arranged a signal with the settlers. If they chose to move, they were supposed to leave some indication of where they had gone, and if they had been forced away under danger, they were meant to carve a cross beside the message. No cross was found. To White, that suggested something important. Perhaps the colony had not ended in sudden violence. Perhaps the settlers had left deliberately, or at least in circumstances calm enough for someone to mark their destination. That small absence, the missing cross, may be one of the most important details in the entire story. It does not solve the mystery, but it changes its shape. The leading theory is also the simplest. The colonists relocated to CROATOAN Island, now Hatteras. It was a place known to the English and connected to nearby indigenous communities. If life on Roanoke had become unsustainable, moving may have offered the only practical route to survival. And there were many reasons to leave. Supplies were limited. The colony had already been isolated far longer than anyone expected. Drought may have made farming difficult. Hunger may have spread quietly through the settlement. At some point, waiting for England may have stopped looking like a plan and started looking like a slow sentence. In that version of events, Roanoke was not the site of one final catastrophe, but the beginning of a migration. The settlers may have dismantled parts of the colony, gathered what they could carry, and moved south toward people and places that offered a better chance of survival than isolation ever could. If so, the mystery is not why they vanished, but why history lost sight of them after they moved. Another theory goes further. Some historians believe the colonists were gradually absorbed into nearby indigenous communities. If survivors joined local societies over time, that could explain why no large burial site or destroyed settlement was ever found. The colony may not have disappeared all at once. It may simply have dissolved into another world, one the English record was never capable of fully seeing. That possibility makes the story even more haunting. Because if Roanoke survivors did blend into existing communities, then the mystery is not supernatural and not even necessarily sudden. It becomes something quieter and more human, a colony that failed, adapted, and was slowly transformed until later generations could no longer recognize its end. In that telling, the people of Roanoke did not vanish into nothing. They vanished into history's blind spot. But not every explanation is so calm. Some believe disease, conflict, or scattered violence may have broken the colony apart before any organized move could take place. In a fragile settlement, disaster does not always arrive as one dramatic event. It can come slowly from several directions at once: a failed harvest, a spreading illness, rising fear, a broken alliance, dwindling hope. A colony can unravel long before anyone realizes it is already ending. That may be why the case still resists a simple answer. Every theory explains part of the evidence, but none explains all of it perfectly. A peaceful relocation fits the carved word. Hardship fits the colony's vulnerability. Assimilation fits the lack of bodies. Conflict explains the fear that may have driven urgent decisions. Yet the final outcome remains hidden behind a silence so complete that it almost feels intentional. And that silence grew louder because John White returned too late. Had he come back after a few months, the trail might still have been visible. Had he returned in 1 year, perhaps more clues would have survived. But after 3 years, weather, time, and memory had already begun erasing the colony's final chapter. Wind, rain, shifting ground, human movement, all of it may have worked together to strip away the details that would have made the story legible. What survived instead was one carved word and the shape of an absence. That is often how historical myths begin, not with certainty, but with fragments. A damaged clue, an interrupted journey, a missing people, just enough evidence to keep every explanation alive and never enough to let one of them win. Roanoke does not survive because we know what happened. It survives because the mystery was left open just wide enough for history and imagination to keep stepping into it. Roanoke endures because it stands on the border between fact and legend. It happened in the real world, to real people, in a documented colonial venture. And yet the ending is so incomplete that it feels almost fictional, as if the colony slipped out of history just before history could record what became of it. The names are real, the place is real, the disappearance is real, but the ending remains strangely out of reach. That tension is what keeps the story alive more than 4 centuries later. The lost colony was not the largest disaster of its age, nor the bloodiest, but it was one of the most unsettling, precisely because it left behind no decisive scene to close the case. No smoking ruin, no final stand, no official account, only emptiness, a carved word, and a return that came too late. Modern historians have tried to piece the mystery together through archaeology, written records, and later accounts. Some clues point toward relocation, others suggest a slower unraveling, but no discovery has delivered the answer people instinctively want: one event, one cause, one final truth. Roanoke refuses to become that simple, and perhaps that is because the truth was never simple to begin with. Colonies do not always end in a single moment. They weaken, divide, adapt, relocate, and disappear in ways that later generations compress into a single legend. Roanoke may have become famous not because it was impossible, but because it was too human, too messy, and too poorly recorded. The real ending may have been less dramatic than the legend, but more haunting for exactly that reason. If the settlers did move to CROATOAN, then the mystery is less about vanishing than survival. If they were absorbed into nearby communities, then the mystery becomes one of identity. If they died in scattered hardship, then the mystery becomes one of memory: who was remembered, who was forgotten, and how quickly an ending can blur when no one is there to write it down. In every version, something real happened. What disappeared was certainty. That may be why the lost colony still haunts history. Not because people literally vanished into thin air, but because they vanished into uncertainty. Their final days were swallowed by distance, delay, incomplete records, and the fragile nature of colonial life itself. What remains is not proof of the impossible. It is something stranger in its own way, a real event that left behind the emotional shape of a ghost story. The people of Roanoke may not be lost in the way legend first imagined, but their story still is. Somewhere between migration, collapse, adaptation, and reinvention, the colony slipped beyond the reach of a clean ending. And that is what transformed it into one of history's most enduring mysteries. Roanoke does not haunt us because the answer is supernatural. It haunts us because the answer may be ordinary, and because time has hidden that ordinary truth so well that it now feels almost unreachable. What happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? We still do not know, and that is exactly why it still haunts history.